Hey guys, and welcome back to The Controversial Mom, where faith, family, and common sense all still matter. I'm your host, Emily Jones. Now, last week we tackled AI in the classroom and how student devices are tracking more than just your kids' homework. But this week we're going to shift from the classroom and we're going to go to the courtroom. Because while schools may be profiling your kids, the federal government recently received a green light to comb through your personal data. And I don't think we've talked about that enough, so we're going to focus on that today. So let's start from the beginning. The Supreme Court ruled that the Department of Government Efficiency, or what we like to call the DOGE, can access millions of Social Security records without a warrant, without consent, most of the time without your knowledge. They simply just get access. They say this is all for fraud prevention and modernization. But if we're being honest, there's a lot of major risks associated with this. And I'm not entirely against it. There's certainly a case for audits in the federal government. I work in the federal government. I promise you, I know that there's a need. But I also can't help but wonder, what if all this was happening under Joe Biden or Obama? Would my opinion of the situation change? And I think it would. So let's unpack the details and see if it changes your opinion too. On June 6th, the Supreme Court ruled in a 6-3 vote that allowed the DOGE to tap into Social Security Administration records. Now, it's important to note that lower courts are still reviewing this situation, so this is not a final decision. But what kind of data are we talking about right now? The records in question include simple things like Social Security numbers, employment and income history, benefit claims such as disability or survivor benefits, and in some cases, medical and family court records. Now, I'm certainly not a supporter of Ketanji Brown Jackson, but I also have to admit I actually agree with some of the comments she's made recently regarding this case. So what is it that she said and why do I agree with her? Because that's a pretty outrageous statement for somebody like me to make. But she recently warned of grave privacy risks for millions of Americans as a result of this case. Because we're not talking about generic files or generic data points. We're talking about real data that's tied to real lives in very, very personal situations. The DOGE argues this is all for fraud detection. And in those situations, I fully support the need to access this kind of data. But if there's not any public oversight and there's no transparency, there's also no real way to know if your data was accessed by this new federal agency, or to know what they did with it, or if they properly protected your identity. That should give everyone pause. I know that it certainly does for me, and I'm a huge fan of the DOGE. Now, the DOGE was created via an executive order during Trump's first few days of office, and it has a very simple yet very bold mission statement that most of us agree with: modernize IT and eliminate federal waste. Both of which are desperately needed within the federal government right now, I promise you. It was originally led by Elon Musk, and the DOGE recruited tech elites to perform sweeping system audits across multiple agencies. And they've done a pretty stellar job. They've only been around for a couple of months, and they've done phenomenal work so far. So far this year alone, they have canceled over 4,000 wasteful contracts. That equates to roughly $32 billion in savings this year alone, and we're only in June. They've also identified $1.2 billion in misallocated HUD funds. And then my favorite, they cleaned up Social Security records by removing 12 million entries that were labeled 120 years or older. That is absolutely outrageous that they did all of that in such a short amount of time. But despite all those wins, some watchdog reports have highlighted a couple of issues, such as missing data protocols, unsafe storage, and limited oversight. And I can tell you from my experience, these are major issues within the government because we are mandated to complete training on these issues every single year. We call it PII, or personally identifying information. And we have to complete training every year on how to protect this information because we have to be held responsible for accessing information that's that important to people. But all these concerns aside, for me, the biggest concern in all of this is feeling that this data collection and analysis is really and truly a building block to an even greater surveillance state. Because once a data pipeline like this one exists, and it's used as it currently is, it's really hard to maintain the size and scope. It usually grows well beyond its intended purpose, and we've all seen that within government programs. But it's in times like this that I am reminded of the famous Ronald Reagan quote. The 9 most scariest words in the world are, "We're from the government and we're here to help." Because right now, the DOGE has access to Social Security benefits and records, IRS and education information. But the bigger question is, what did they gain access to tomorrow, a year from now, or even 5 years from now? Will they start collecting political affiliation records? What about voting records, homeschool registrations, or even our healthcare choices? We've all had similar concerns to this before when we were dealing with education, big tech, and pharma. Think back to the days of COVID and the fear of the medical database. That wasn't that long ago, people. It was very recently. The main difference between then and now is that Trump is in office. And for some reason, that alone has convinced a lot of people that there's nothing wrong with this level of access to our personal data. But for me, I'm still very concerned because that's my information that someone's accessing and I don't know who or why. As a budgeting mom with 15 years in finance, I totally understand that audits matter. I totally understand that fraud costs taxpayers real money. But accessing our personal data still requires guardrails. We need defined and limited access to this data. We need transparency reports, and we need congressional oversight. Because without these, it's not really about efficiency, it's about more unchecked power within the government. And of course now, Elon's gone from the DOGE, and leadership now falls to a guy named Russ Vought. He's the former OMB director, and I have to admit, I'm a huge fan of Russ Vought. He's extremely sharp, extremely financially savvy. He's very serious about reform and saving our country, but most importantly, he's an unapologetic Christian. But with Russ taking over at the DOGE, it also raises a key question. What happens when he's no longer in charge? When leadership changes result in someone new at the top with different motives and full access to your personal data, will that change your opinion of this court case? For me, I certainly think it does. So that's why I agree with some of the safeguards the opposition's calling for. Now, some of those include codified oversight language written into law, congressional reviews, and my favorite, a challenge process for citizens to use if they feel like their data has not been properly maintained. These mechanisms will help to preserve efficiency and accountability, which is what the DOGE was originally created for. And that will help things stay in place regardless of who takes charge or who's sitting in the White House. Now, most people are not aware of something called the Privacy Act of 1974, but I've heard about it a lot because it's what I get trained on every single year. So let's break down what the Privacy Act of 1974 is. It governs how agencies handle personal data. It dictates how data is stored, who can access it, and who can use it, most importantly. It also includes some exceptions, and it also includes enforcement. Now, the Trump administration contends that one of the exceptions in this act allows for internal data exchange if it relates to the official duties of an agency. They're arguing that without access to the data, the DOGE can't actually modernize federal IT or detect systemic fraud, which is what it was all created for. On its face, modernization and fraud fighting are obviously objectives that most Americans support. But if we don't have boundaries on scope, scale, or the duration of this access, there's danger in normalizing a surveillance state beyond what we already see. We risk setting precedences that are extremely hard for us to reverse in the future, especially if future administrations have very different aims, like we've recently seen with the Biden administration. So with all that in mind, the question remains, what is it that we need to do? Well, right now, the answer is pretty simple. We need to stay informed on this situation, and we need to stay engaged. We need to continue to look into the details of this situation, and we need to make sure that we're being honest about the stakes of it, regardless of who's in power. We need to continue to be skeptical of the outcomes. And we shouldn't just blindly agree with the DOGE simply because Trump is in office. While I do understand the logic, we can't be complacent just because Trump is there. We need to ensure that we're thinking long-term effects of what this case is going to do, not just on our lives, but our children's lives, because there are real implications to what's happening here. Now, next Sunday, I'm totally pivoting away from AI. I promise we're going to take this in a totally different route. Next week, we're going to pick up on something I call the Trump 2.0 series, and we're going to focus on the America First travel ban. We're going to unpack the 12 countries that have been banned, look at the 7 partial restrictions, and what's at stake for our sovereignty. Because whether it's who can see your data or who can cross our borders, these are not small decisions. They're foundational to our values and our future as a country. So if defending liberty, sovereignty, and accountability makes us controversial, well, so be it, people. We're going to have to gladly wear that badge with honor. Until next time, guys, stay bold, stay grounded, but most of all, stay controversial.